You know, if I now spend the time in thanking to Michael, you will say that I'm doing practical diplomacy because he's our boss around here. But I really want to thank him for allowing us to use the facilities of Square Pattern Box for this nice purpose, as it is this conference of Institute for Cultural Diplomacy. So right now you see me in a different role. So I'm a speaker, not just the one who is chairing, and you are probably wondering, didn't I have speak already more than enough, so probably I should be silent for a little bit. But I intentionally, after those 2 days, 2 very successful days, I think that we all agree that we had first at American University and now at the Bulgarian Embassy, where we had the opportunity to listen from several ambassadors, and this afternoon we'll continue to some more ambassadors. Ambassador of Albania is already here with us. Ambassador of Croatia will come later. Real ambassador of Croatia, not myself, who just have a title ambassador, but I do not represent Croatia. I do represent Square Pattern Box, and in this event I really do represent Institute for Cultural Diplomacy. So as you could see, the title of my presentation, that I will try to keep really brief and let you to ask me question, is diplomacy is in Washington, D.C. So maybe listening all those ambassadors, listening to all of us, maybe you are wondering, what are all those people doing? And what is their job? And how they are making their salary? And is there any purpose in that? So I'll just briefly reflect on that in 10 minutes, and then I'll let you ask some questions, and we will proceed with our program for the day. So basically what ambassadors do, they represent their own countries in traditional definition of diplomacy. And in traditional division of diplomacy, there are basically 2 big parts of diplomatical work. One is bilateral diplomacy, the other is multilateral diplomacy. That is how diplomats think about themselves. Even in their professions, in their career, they divide in that 2 groups. Cultural diplomacy should be spread all over the space of the work of diplomacy, and as we discussed before, much more than diplomacy. What is specific case of Washington, D.C.? I mean, the fact is that the United States, we can like it or dislike it, is for more or less any country in the world the most important foreign partners or country to work. That is simply the reality of the world that we live. That's one characteristic. So, for definition of diplomatic work, it is mostly bilateral diplomacy. So what Madam Ambassador is doing, what all those ambassadors were doing this morning, it is bilateral diplomacy. What is the purpose of bilateral diplomacy? I should say it has basically 2 big purposes. Through promotion, or with the idea of promoting your own country, you have to establish as good and as close relations, or to be able to achieve your goals in dealing with the administration. That's one goal. The other goal is you have to promote your own country to the general audience, or to the Americans, as we should say. Both goals are extremely important everywhere, particularly here in the United States. So that is kind of very traditional division what the diplomats in bilateral diplomacy are doing. When we come to Washington, D.C., it becomes a little bit more complex than that. Why? When it comes first, then in contrary to many capitals and to many countries where you have the one institution that you mostly deal, and maybe then some additional institutions. So typically diplomats are dealing with the ministries of foreign affairs. In theory, that's also in Washington, D.C., but that's just the beginning, and maybe not even 10% of your work. You are dealing with all other institutions, like all those ambassadors that you listened this morning. For them, relations with DOD, Ministry of Defense, or NSC, National Security Councils, is almost of same importance as a foreign office and people who are directly in diplomacy. Frankly speaking, that also depends who is the Secretary of State. You have sometimes Secretary of State that insists that you deal through the only their office, but sometimes and mostly you have a Secretary of State that will allow to diplomats to do what they typically do, dealing with all that office. That is specificity of Washington, D.C. Another, even bigger, in the United States, in contrary to many other countries, European countries and European democracy, here there is extremely important role of Congress in foreign affairs. Yesterday we had the two great senators from before, Chuck Hagel and George Mitchell, and they were both serving in a foreign relations committee. To establish good relations between your own countries and United States of America, frankly speaking, the Foreign Relations Committee at the Hill, both in Senate and in the House of Representatives, is sometimes more important than executive part of the branch. And that is the difference in bilateral diplomacy in comparison if you are ambassador to Germany, ambassador to, of course, when you are in Germany, you go and you visit Bundestag. Occasionally you give a speech. But in reality, for relations between your countries, the Bundestag will not close as big role as here the Hill or the Congress will play. So that is one specific thing. And the other, in the United States, in Washington, precisely, you have also multilateral diplomacy because you have multilateral institutions here. You have a World Bank, you have a number of other institutions which are not only, you have IMF, you have a number of institutions that are not uniquely and only Americans, regardless if they were founded and organized by American government, but they serve different purposes, and so it is, in a way, even in a way, how you approach your work, it is multilateral diplomacy, so not anymore bilateral diplomacy. In bilateral diplomacy, it is very much important to be present as a part of the life of Washington, D.C., where that brings us to the cultural diplomacy, because as you could hear from today's speeches, cultural and culture in diplomatic life is something which is very, very, very important through the promotion of culture and through the exchange of any kind of cultural activities. You are also achieving your goal, and that is promoting and presenting your own country. And then you have in Washington something which is rather specific, and let me, without trying to advertise us or anyone else, you have something that started, it is not anymore unique for Washington, but that started as a kind of Washington activity. You have companies, big companies, large companies and strong companies that are that they exist in helping you to do your job. Typically, they are called lobbying company. We don't really like when they label us that way, because they also bring negative connotations. And today, you are all sitting in one of those companies, arguably the most successful company, because Patent Box before and now Squire Patent Box represented more sovereign countries than any other company in Washington, D.C. From Croatia, where I come, Albania, several other countries that we have this morning, number of countries from Europe, number of countries from Africa, from Asia. So what do we do? And it is still role of diplomats and role of ambassadors to work with us. So we basically assist them the way where they cannot achieve the job by themselves. So we have people who are specialized in any area of activities that one country can have. Let's take as a simple example like double taxation treaty. More or less all countries sign double taxation treaty with the United States. In order to do that, you need to have people who will help you with that. You need to have people who will be able to present that to the American administration and who will be able to help you to do the job. So that is one big part of the work of diplomacy in Washington, which until relatively recently was rather unique. When you represent your country in Berlin, you typically do not hire law or lobbying firm to help you with that. In Paris also. Only 2 cities in the world you do that. That's Washington, D.C., and now even more Brussels. More complex is the structure that you are dealing. More urgent is your need to have somebody to help you with that. And you will not be surprised when I tell you that last year, for the first time, I think in the history of that, we should call it almost profession, which is public policy, as we call it here, a square pattern box, or lobbying, as it is colloquially called. More money was spent in Brussels, D.C. than in Washington, in Brussels, Belgium, than in Washington, D.C. And why? Simply because of the, I think it's fair to say, of necessity. When you come as ambassador, you have your team. Small team like Albania, a little bit bigger team like Bulgaria or Croatia, or even huge team like Saudi Arabia or not Germany or France because they are in different category, or China. You need still somebody who knows how really Washington works, who knows to address you, to what door to knock, who will know to tell you who is George Mitchell if you are going to the Hill, and who is Chuck Hagel? They are past, so I can talk about them, or anybody else. If you, as the embassy, try to do and achieve that, you will probably spend your tenure, which is typically 4 years, in diplomatic life 3 to 5, and without being achieved anything or little bit. Again, this is not advertising our company. There are other companies that are doing that. This is simply realistic presentation of how Washington works. And we can say, oh yeah, we like that way because it brings the quality. Or we can say, oh, I don't like that way. Why should I be paying some Americans to do the job for my country? But that is the reality of Washington. If you want to be efficient, then you have that kind of approach. So now I'll do two things. First, I will allow you to ask me any questions about that, not about my political positions or positions on cultural diplomacy. We had a lot of exchange yesterday and this morning about that, but if you want to ask me anything about how diplomacy in reality is functioning here in Washington, D.C., because I had all different roles here. I came here as a relatively young diplomat, not without experience. I was before that deputy foreign minister, and I was ambassador to United Nations in Geneva. But then for 5 years I was Croatian ambassador here in D.C. Then I went again to teach diplomacy, so I was professor. Then I came back to Washington to work with one consulting company. We are doing only consulting in that time. And lobbying, there I went back to Croatia, where I was minister hiring consulting and lobbying company, and then I came back here working for one of the good examples. So I think that I have pretty good insight in how that is work and how we can maximize in using all those different aspects of the. When you're asking me, you don't need to ask me only about lobbying firm. Ask me about any aspect of diplomatic work, particularly in Washington, D.C. And then after that, I will introduce the colleague of mine who is also part of the, now she can be a supporter of your work, but before she will be the target of the work of the most diplomats and ambassadors. Let me stop here and allow you to ask any question that you might think about how diplomacy in Washington works. Sorry?
Does your company work in Brussels?
We do have office in Brussels, yes. And we are getting more and more involved in this kind of activity of Brussels. You know, in Brussels, before, that is one difference between Washington, D.C. and Brussels. Here, we do have two categories of companies. We have clearly lobbying and consulting firms. You heard recently about some, I will not come with the names, but they are no law firm. They are just a firm who are mostly former politicians, number of former senators and congressmen, so they work together. I used to work in one of that, founded by two former congressmen, Livingston and Moffett. One was from the right angle, very conservative Republican. The other was very liberal Democrat. I was head of European activities, so I cover Europe, and we did lobbying and consulting for number of European companies and states all world, a number of American companies who wanted to do business there. So in Brussels, that's typically still the case. In Washington, actually most of the job is done by the firm which are law firm, like what we are. Patent box before, although many people, if you open the textbook of lobbying and public policy, the most probably as the founder of the discipline, you will find the name of Tom Box, who was the founder of this very company. Unfortunately, he passed away, so he's not anymore present, but he will be credited as the one who started that business, merging law and lobbying. So in Washington, most of that job is covered by big law firm who are doing both. I mean, we have big public policy department here. So what is the difference in having that approach in comparison to traditional law firm? Whenever client comes to us, we try to approach the problem from all different aspects, not just from a legal aspect, but from all different aspects. In difference to that, in Brussels, most of the lobbying firm are just a lobbying firm. It is something relatively new that the law firm, including us, are also introducing the practice that we have in Washington, that we introduce it in Brussels. I frankly was always advocate of that. When I was a minister, I hired one law firm in Brussels because I knew that I need some lobbying in Brussels, but I intentionally decided to take a law firm. And at that time, that was the only law firm that has a very decent lobbying practice in Brussels. That's not anymore case. Now we are all starting to compete more and more in a Brussels market, but it is still new. If I can say it is approximation, I think that 70% of the lobbying work in Washington is done by law firm, maybe even more now, maybe closer to 80%. In Brussels, it will be 20, maximum 30% will be law firm. The rest will be just the lobbying and how they call themselves, lobbying and consulting. And in the terms of the size of the work, we are really talking billions, literally billions of dollars on both sides.
Again, I will ask you.
Yep.
How about you in New York?
Oh, we are very big in New York. All Washington firm, I mean almost all firms in Washington firms also have offices in New York, because New York is a little bit different. We also do party lobbying in New York. We do United Nations. I have my great colleague and partner is one of the most famous American ambassador of all time, Frank Wisner, who is based in New York. So we also take, if our client can be sovereign state, has some interest in United Nations, we also can do that part of the job. No restrictions for us to do it. I mean, there are a number of restrictions, particularly recently. That restrictions existed always, like that. If you are listening American news now, there is a lot of stories about registration. We, as the most of serious companies, we were always very serious. We do not represent foreign entities and foreign clients without being registered. But there are some who are doing that, obviously. Any more questions?
What do you consider some of your greatest challenges and successes, both from a multilateral and a bilateral perspective?
When I came here as ambassador, that was immediately after Dayton Peace Accords, and so we were entering into a new stage, and we wanted to develop different kind and different quality of relations with the United States. So a lot of challenges. Unfortunately, didn't go so easy. One of my first job was to organize economic trip to Croatia and to the region, and that trip by totally, I don't know what is accidental in life, what is not, but I'm not going to enter into deep other field of unknown. But nevertheless, very soon after I came here, I organized the presidential mission, the presidential meaning the mission of President Clinton, who was president in that time, that was led by Ron Brown, the Secretary of Commerce in that time. Ron Brown was the partner at Patton Box. He was in this very building. As a matter of fact, that is the first time when I heard about Patton Box, when we had a dinner at Four Seasons. When we get out, he showed me where was his room. Actually, now I sit in a room that was occupied by his son, Michael Brown, who was here. So that was big challenge, and particularly because that mission ended, as some of you might know, tragically, because the plane coming to Dubrovnik, Croatia, crashed. An entire, all of them were killed. So aside from the people from Secretary of, Commerce Department, there were 15 CEOs of the largest American companies. So that put us very much back. If you want me to come for the moment to the cultural diplomacy, I came to diplomacy from different area. I was not career diplomat, I was university professor, and I happen to like and love some part of the art. As you could already hear, I love opera and music. So very soon when I came here, I already knew Placido Domingo, so he was in that time director of Washington National Opera. We became very soon friends, and after premiere of one opera, Placido came with all crew for a midnight reception at Croatian embassy. And all Washington media was reporting about that. It was kind of shocking. You have a lot of culture here. All embassies are really trying to do. We heard this morning Ambassador of Georgia saying what they are doing. And you have one big event in Washington, very prestigious event, and that is Opera Ball. So every year, one of the big embassies that is not for us small, but it's typically France, United Kingdom, Italy, they have a ball in their space, but you have like 10 other embassies that are organizing dinners prior to that. Those are big contributors to Washington Opera and Washington Cultural Life who are participating. You as embassy, you do things not for a profit, you do it to promote your own country. So when you have somebody like that, and this country, and diplomacy works through the known people. When you have somebody like Placido Domingo, he is really extreme case that happened to me, then it is much easier. I had a colleague that I will not name the name, but in that time he had a budget for cultural promotion, $2 million. I had an ambassador will understand very well that my total budget was a little bit over 2 million. So they came with a list of the, in Washington Post, they published a big article about the culture in the embassy or embassy here. And somehow we end third on that list after the two first place are always reserved for France and Italy because they spend huge money. And friend of mine, ambassador who had a 2 million budget, he was not on a list, and he was extremely furious. And I said to him, let's make a deal. Give us half of that money, of that 2 million that you are getting, and promise you'll be on the list. we never did that, and they are doing it. I mean, the country, I should mention actually that country, but in a positive sense, because that is the country that achieved more than any country in the history of civilization by promotion of cultural diplomacy. And that country is Austria. Yes, they are spending a lot of money. In that time, the budget was 2 million, which is a huge budget. 1 million they would spend for Opera Ball here, and 1 million for all other activities. But Austria has a really good outcome of that, because the country of Austria, not counting Switzerland, who did that cultural promotion a long time ago, and they continue. But in late 50s, Austria was divided, was destroyed country. I mean, was in many respects, aside from position, in many respects much worse than what was Croatia or Albania nowadays. So by really doing that, I would dare to say that there was no country that invested and that they do more in cultural diplomacy than Austria in achieving. If you want to joke that sometimes I tell to them, and I didn't invent the joke, it is how successful they are. They are so successful that they managed to convince the world that Beethoven was Austrian and Hitler was not. Yeah. In reality, as you know, Beethoven was German and Hitler was Austrian. That's sometimes the power of cultural diplomacy. If you do not, you can ask me later any question, but if you do not have any more question now, I will turn and give the podium to colleague of, you do, please.
How successful have you been in Africa? If not, you have not, how have you managed?
I'll tell you very frankly, here we are very good in dealing with Africa. We have several people who are in extremely good relations with African countries. But when we are talking about the Africa, except for geographical term, I don't think that there is one concept, one entity that we can call Africa. There are a number of the countries, some of them able to define what are their interest, what is the purpose of doing that, some even not being able to define that. This is not criticism, this is just observation. And of course there is that traditional division of sub-Sahara Africa or an Africa which belongs to other part of the world, which is totally different in political terms, in something else. But it's fair to say that countries on the north of Africa, they are spending huge efforts to establish good relations, and they are, if anyone, they are getting good outcomes of that. When it comes to the traditional African countries, I really don't see that. I don't know if we represent any of them. I do know that we do have good relations, and I do think that there are a lot of opportunities. But to talk about, in general terms, Africa, I think that it is not something that pragmatically should bring to something. It's more to talk about specific countries. And my friend and colleague, Tom Kane, who is dealing with the business development, probably has more to say.
Over the years, we've represented probably, I want to say, a dozen African countries in either in a sovereign representation where we're representing the public's interests here in Washington, or following that, or completely separate from that, representing them on a specific issue related to anything that might be of critical importance to that particular country. I can think of at least a half a dozen of them are African right now. Ghana, Cameroon, Morocco, Egypt, Sudan, South Sudan, Libya. Miomir and I are talking to people in Libya as we speak. Nigeria, not so much south of that. I don't believe Kenya is on the list, but we actually have a situation that might develop there. So over the 50 plus years that patent box has been in existence, Square Patent Box has been an entity for the last almost 4 years. We've represented scores of countries. And several of us traveled there. I was just in Senegal twice in the last 2 years. And their embassies right down the street, they're neighbors of ours. So we're very interested in that.
So now I will try to do two things to answer the first question that I was asked and introduce our next speaker. So the question, what was my achievement here? One of my achievements was indeed related to the work with Exim Bank and how it happened. You know, we are a country getting out of the war, and you want to have investment, because without investment there is no progress. But how to reach and how to come to the investment, as I already said, unfortunately we didn't start very well, because that was with Meyer, what we can say. Somebody else decided on that destiny, or whatever we call it, so the presidential mission didn't succeed. We knew that if we want to develop Croatia, we must build a road, because without roads you cannot do, there is no development of the economy. But how to build a road when nobody wants to invest the money, and you are coming out of the war and with refugees and with everything else, nobody wanted to finance the road. To any financial institution you come, they say, okay, you want to build a road, what is the traffic on that road? And there is no traffic because there is no road. And that really turned into chicken and egg conversation, and we couldn't move, frankly. And this is absolutely true story. Many of my colleagues experience same story. That story changed when in one moment, somehow I will not go into details of that, we managed to get Exim Bank to support that. That is partly role of the Exim Bank, but only partly. When Exim Bank accepted that they are prepared to take a risk of building a road in Croatia, they will do that only if there was American company, and indeed it was American company, but frankly, again, it was American and Turkish company. It was Bechtel and Enka. So I came together with a little bit of influence of George Schultz, who just arranged the meeting. But I came with a representative of Bechtel and CEO, or the owner of Enka. We came to the president of Exim in that time, and very soon Exim the moment when Exim accepted that they are behind us, we were able to finance the road. And Mark was telling you yesterday the story how we were riding along that. So now Croatia, from maybe less than 100 kilometers, not miles, less than 100 kilometers of the highways that we used to have before in time of Yugoslavia, we have now more than 2,000 kilometers. And everything started in '98 when Exim decided, okay, they are prepared to take a little bit of risk and to help us in that. So now it is my great privilege to have here among us, as a part of Squire Patton Box, the woman who was a very, very important person at Exim Bank, and who will tell you a little bit more from the different perspectives, from the perspective of somebody who is listening the other side and maybe deciding what the Exim will do it. And it is, as I said, part of diplomatic work. So Angela, although I understand that everybody calls you Manana, Frere is a principal at Squire Patton Box, but she joined to the company from Exim Bank. And without saying anything more, because there is her CV that you can read here, Manana, can you please continue?